Lord Frost will be here to give us a taste of what it was like inside the EU's negotiating room. State of the Nation starts now. We'll also be hearing from our fantastic panel. Former editor of The Sun, Kelvin Mackenzie, is here, as well as the Labour MP, Lloyd Russell-Moyle. We can promise controversy and confrontation, but possibly, unlikely, some compromise too. As ever, I want to hear from you. Please get in touch by emailing mailmog@gbnews.uk. Before all of that, it's been a busy day, and here to keep us up to date is Tatiana Sanchez.
Jacob, good evening and thank you very much. Our top story this evening, police searching for the missing baby of Constance Martin and Mark Gordon say the remains of a baby have been found close to where the couple were arrested. Police say it was the news that they and the public did not want to hear. Martin and Gordon had been missing since January the 5th until their arrest on Monday night. Police have said the pair remain in custody after an application for a 36-hour extension to detain them. The newborn's parents, who spent 53 days on the run, have been further arrested on suspicion of gross negligence manslaughter. The parents of a morbidly obese 16-year-old girl have been jailed for gross negligence manslaughter in the first televised court hearing in Wales. Kayla Titford was found dead at her home in Newton in 2020 after suffering from an infection caused by extreme obesity. At the time of her death, she weighed nearly 23 stone and she had a BMI of 70. Her mother admitted the charge and was jailed for 6 years. Her father, who pled not guilty, was sentenced to 7 years and 6 months. The Prime Minister says we must wait for the results of the official inquiry before judging the government's handling of the COVID pandemic. It comes after the Telegraph claimed former Health Secretary Matt Hancock rejected advice from the Chief Medical Officer to test all residents before allowing them to enter a care home. A spokesperson for Mr. Hancock says thousands of his WhatsApp messages have been stolen and doctored to create a false story.
Families across the country will look at this, and the sight of politicians writing books, portraying themselves as heroes or selectively leaking messages will be insulting and ghoulish spectacle for them. At the heart of this is every family who made enormous sacrifices for the good of the country, or who tragically lost loved ones. The country deserves better.
Rather than comment on piecemeal bits of information, I'm sure the honourable gentleman would agree with me, the right way for these things to be looked at is the COVID inquiry. That's why we've established the COVID inquiry. And he will know, as he has mentioned it 1 or 2 times before, that he was a lawyer in a previous life, that there is a proper process to these things. It is an independent inquiry.
The Greek Transport Minister has resigned after 2 trains collided, killing at least 36 people and injuring more than 85. The intercity train was carrying over 300 passengers when it hit a freight train near the city of Larissa. A station master in charge of signalling has been arrested and charged with causing mass deaths through negligence. Firefighters say the death toll is expected to rise. Labour is calling for victims of the Turkey earthquakes to be granted temporary UK visas. Opposition MPs want the visa scheme to be available for families that have had to flee after quakes struck their country and Syria in early February, leaving at least 50,000 dead. And for our television viewers, hold your breath, for this near miss on what seems a quiet residential road in West Sussex turns into something a little more dramatic. 2 people on a moped narrowly avoid being hit by a train travelling 70 miles per hour. They were riding through red flashing lights whilst the barriers were down. Police described it as stupidly reckless behaviour. TV, online and DAB Plus radio. This is GB News. Now it's back to Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Well, welcome back. The main news of today is the extraordinary story in the Daily Telegraph about the leak of thousands of messages from Matt Hancock within his office about how the COVID restrictions were being handled. And there have been all sorts of issues coming up from this and allegations that we'll be discussing. But incidentally, I've been included in this about a test that was sent to me or to one of my children. What happened was that one of my children needed a test, and that put everybody into quarantine. But unfortunately, the testing people lost it. And that meant I was quarantined, unable to do my job as a government minister, for several days until it was admitted that this had been lost. At that point, it was raised with the Department of Health, and they decided to send a test to a member of my family so the test could be carried out. Not something I asked for. So if I received any special treatment, it wasn't because I had requested it, but actually it allowed a government minister to get back to work with a child that didn't have COVID in the first place, who wouldn't have needed a special test had the system actually been working. But I accept it wasn't working for other people too. But let's get back to what happened when the outbreak began. In the internet informational blizzard of early 2020, the world changed and our nation changed. The pictures coming from China, then Italy, suggested that we faced a threat the likes of which we had not known for generations. In such a fast-paced, interconnected world, global travel, our island nation, once that fortress built by nature for herself against infection and the hand of war, can unfortunately no longer escape the misfortunes of less happier lands so easily. As the first duty of a government is to keep the country secure and its citizens safe, we took the counsel of experts who told us, in no uncertain terms, that if we did not take the radical steps they were demanding, we'd expect mass death. 500,000 deaths were being forecast. The crematoriums were going to be overrun. Under these conditions, any responsible Prime Minister would have ordered the first lockdown. But as early as June 2020, the advice of the health authorities increasingly did not match the reality. The danger was not as severe as they had been forecasting. But yet businesses were still being crushed. Essential medical interventions were missed. Lives were ruined. Children were quite wrongly denied their schooling, and spouses were separated at the hour of their death, unable to utter their final goodbyes to each other face to face. So I and several other cabinet members began to raise questions. The Prime Minister at the time, Boris Johnson, deserves a great deal of credit for taking the brave and correct step not to lock down for the Omicron variant, despite the cries, the same cries as before, of much of the press, the experts, and of course, Mr. Snoozefest or Sir Keir Snoozefest and the opposition benches. England is the mother of parliaments. No place on earth has contributed to the development of liberty, democracy, and the dignity of mankind more so than that of the building behind me. And yet, shamefully, for some months, many months, its corridors and chambers, which once played host to Peel, to Gladstone, to Disraeli, to Churchill, to Lady Thatcher, enacted policies that stripped basic liberties from British subjects that should and are their birthrights. This is what the COVID inquiry must focus on. The technicalities of COVID policy, such as the procurement of medical equipment or PPE, or the testing or non-testing of care home patients, are not irrelevant, but the inquiry should not be directed towards them. It must focus on the devastating, incalculable consequences of putting the whole country effectively under house arrest. Lockdown must never happen again. But I, as always, want to know what you think. Please get in touch. Email me, mailmog@gbnews.uk. But this evening we have a special treat in store for you, because I'm now joined by the Associate Editor of the Daily Telegraph, who brought this story to us this morning, and GB News' very own. A few weeks ago she was grilling me, and now I have her here as a commentator, Camilla Tominey. Thank you so much for coming in.
Good evening, nice to see you.
It's great to see you. You were quite lockdown sceptic from pretty early on, weren't you?
Yes. I mean, I think as a newspaper we were trying to have a look at this diktat of following the science and find out whether that was actually happening and whether the science that was being followed was comprehensive and representative of the entire picture. We know and we understand why the impetus was to protect the NHS and to save lives. And people willingly obeyed that diktat in the early stages of the pandemic because there were many unknowns and we were dealing with an unprecedented set of circumstances. However, as you have just alluded to there, Jacob, as the months rolled on, I think it was only right to apply a degree of journalistic scrutiny to some of the advice that was being received by ministers and the decision-making of ministers. And don't forget that that decision-making seemed to shrink somewhat. You know, in the past, we've talked about Tony Blair sort of operating in a sofa government style. What was happening is that small committees were making decisions that were then being rubber-stamped by the wider cabinet. There was concern, perhaps, that decisions were being made on instinct and gut, as opposed to by following the proper public health protocols. So what the lockdown files do is they sort of lift the lid on some of that decision making, not so much a sofa government as at times a government by WhatsApp. We appreciate that that only represents a fraction of the conversations that were taking place at the time. But what these messages do reveal, and let's face it, there's 100,000 of them, there's 2.3 million words that the investigations team at the Telegraph have poured through. What they suggest is that sometimes decisions were being made for political reasons, for PR ones, and I think the public has a right to know when their lives and their liberty were put at stake in an unprecedented manner, how some of those decisions were taken.
And one of the things that's been highlighted is that the decision on masks in schools was made because Nicola Sturgeon had done it and they didn't want to have a row because she'd done something. There was no medical evidence for it, so we were told we were following the science. But if these WhatsApp messages are right, and I know Matt Hancock's been saying that they've been doctored and so on and so forth,
Yeah,
we'll see about that.
they haven't been doctored, just to clarify.
But he's been saying that, so we need to note what he's said.
Sure.
It was being done for purely political reasons and PR reasons,
yes.
And people's lives were being made less comfortable just to keep up with Nicola Sturgeon.
Well, if that's what these messages suggest, and we know at the time that there was a great deal of confusion over the efficacy of masks, not least because you had those in the medical profession saying they'd only be useful if they were literally surgical and being put on and then put in a bag and then hands washed, etc. And yet the government was recommended that we made masks at home. Some decisions were made because of the optics. There's still intrigue around this comment that Matt Hancock made in the message when he decided to go against Chris Whitty's advice on testing all people coming into care homes as opposed to just those coming from hospital, that it muddied the waters. Muddied what waters exactly? Muddied waters on his testing ambition for 100,000 tests?
Well, I thought that actually came across in a different way, and that what he was saying was that there simply aren't enough tests to test everybody going in, because that's very early on, isn't it? That's April 2020,
sure.
And they're trying to boost the testing. They know they can test everyone in hospital, but if they try and test everybody in the community as well, they wouldn't necessarily do everybody in hospital, and they had limited resources.
The counter-argument to that would be, if there was a problem around testing, and in fact the government guidance, it wasn't until the August of 2020 where it was mandated that all going into care homes should be tested from community and hospitals. If that was the case, why was he using the terminology early on in the pandemic to suggest that a protective ring had been placed around care homes? What we know, because of the diktat of April the 2nd, which said that people could be released into care homes without being tested, and I appreciate that hindsight does a lot of heavy lifting. Anyone involved in care homes, and I can speak personally on this issue because my father runs one, he's a retired GP who's worked in the care home sector for decades, could have said that that was not the right decision to take. You know, Dad had to shut down his home before he was advised to do so by the government because of all of his medical training suggested that his residents were going to be the most vulnerable against this disease.
And wasn't there a fundamental problem about the whole line on save the NHS? Isn't the NHS there to save us?
Yes.
Rather than the other way round, that the NHS is the servant of the state rather than this great body that we all have to operate to help it carry out its business?
Yes, and also that quest to save the NHS at times put private care providers in a precarious position, because as Helen Whately, who was the care minister at the time, had pointed out to Matt Hancock in these messages, a lot of the PPE was going straight to the NHS, and so private care providers couldn't get the PPE they needed. I remember my father saying about how he'd had 400 masks delivered and they were kind of old-style tie-at-the-back ones. They were completely useless for barrier nursing. So you then had the government in this strange predicament of saying to the care sector, you must take people to free up hospital beds, but at the same time not adequately equipping them. Even in September 2020, my father had written a piece for The Telegraph saying that the testing situation was in a fiasco. You've spoken about your family situation. At one point, we had 150 tests at the care home go missing. You then have the situation of asymptomatic residents and carers, perhaps spreading the virus among others. I mean, it wasn't plain sailing, and I don't think the care sector felt that they had a protective ring around them.
Well, I think so often you show the virtues of a free press that ensured these questions were raised, even as the pandemic was going on. Thank you so much for coming in. Don't forget to tune in to Camilla's show. Camilla, as I said, interviewed me a few weeks ago, this Sunday at 9:30. After the break, the idlers of the RMT have announced more strikes. And what else do they do? And we'll be hearing from a trade union activist, as well as someone who could be described as precisely opposite. Don't even think of going anywhere.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, no, stop arguing. I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment.
I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates.
Do you not believe in prison?
I don't believe in prison.
I'm completely stunned. I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed.
So I guess they've always been quite woke.
That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News. The People's Channel. Britain's news channel.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
You're an inspiration to us all.
Clip that bit up.
Well, you are.
That's my ringtone. My political ambitions those days are gone, I can tell you.
She's only teasing. Go on.
He's probably going to want to lay down now. I'll give him 2 minutes to have one. Let's respectfully disagree. That's what we like on Jubes and Kerr. Come and join us. GB News, the People's Channel.
Michelle Dewberry, weekday evenings at 6 o'clock.
I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m.
What's the scoop?
I'll be joined by 2 of the country's top comedians.
That's right.
As we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight.
We're going to get into trouble.
If it's a big story, we'll be covering it.
Spill some tea on him.
There we go.
But we'll also have some fun.
I wouldn't stick up a bank.
My father didn't love me.
So anyway.
Headliners every night from 11 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
We are GB News, the People's Channel.
And right across the United Kingdom.
You can find us on Sky Channel 512.
Virgin Media Channel 604.
Freesat Channel 216.
Freeview Channel 236.
And YouView Channel 236.
You can also take us with you on DAB Plus Radio.
With the GB News app and at the website gbnews.uk.
We're absolutely everywhere.
Come join us on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. I'm still Jacob Rees-Mogg, and this is State of the Nation. And thank you. You've been getting in touch with your thoughts. Keith, you are kind. Sir, you have taken like a duck to water to this new project, and so we simply would like to thank you. Not an easy task, but it flowed like silk. Or should we say the best vintage Somerset cider? Excellent. We've slightly changed our meal times. This is a real compliment to get it out of the way for 8 o'clock. Very few, I never change anything, so thank you for that. Bob, in 1973, VAT was introduced at 5%. Why can't we get rid of VAT now? And Neil, why did the UK government fall for lockdowns when Sweden and Japan never did and had better outcomes? Now, I was known for being critical of home-working civil servants during my time in government as Minister for Efficiency. However, I should give them credit for multitasking. These civil servants have an impeccable ability to procrastinate, be unproductive, and go on strike all at the same time. Yes, 130,000 civil servants have organised a fresh round of strikes due on the 15th of March. I'm surprised. I didn't think they could organise anything as well. But joking aside, this poses two very important questions. First, will anyone notice? And since these loafers remain on their sofas and refuse to return to the office, is it possible to picket your own home? Along with the civil service, the RMT has announced tube strikes on the same day in 2 weeks' time. Well, this is the People's Channel, so for our nightly edition of Vox Populi Vox Dei, we asked you, is the public being held to ransom by those striking? The people have spoken.
I think some of them have a very good argument that they're not getting paid enough, considering they're comparing themselves to some in government who are getting paid an awful lot more. Yeah. And I think they've got a valid point that they need, with the cost of living crisis, to earn more money to survive.
It's caused an awful lot of not just economic suffering, but I'd say psychological too.
I personally feel that, now with the situation that is there, it's all across the world, financially people are having a problem. Yeah. So they should actually put it up and sit in for a discussion and, see how this could be resolved. Because this creates a lot of problem, not only for themselves, but also for the people. Because a lot of people are having unemployment right now.
Well, thank you very much. I'm joined now by the trade union activist, Paul Embry. Paul, thank you so much for joining me. We probably start from a different point of view on strikes, but I wonder if you could give the case for the strikes. Why do you think they're justified? And why do you think they're not holding the British public to ransom?
Well, I think they're justified, Jacob, simply because so many people are being asked once again to accept a real terms pay cut and are being asked again to pay for an economic crisis that they didn't create. We've had 14 years of this. We had the global financial crisis in 2008, since when we've had pretty paltry pay increases. We're now going through the cost of living crisis. People are increasingly finding it difficult to make ends meet, finding it difficult to pay their mortgages, to pay their energy bills, to put food on the table. And the constant promise from the government of jam tomorrow simply isn't good enough. People actually want a real terms pay increase now rather than another real terms pay cut. And what we're seeing, by the way, are many thousands of workers who have never been on strike before, many of whom would never have dreamed actually of going on strike in the occupations that they are in. But simply because they have reached the end of their tether, they feel that this is the only option that's available to them. I mean, as to your question about whether or not they're holding the country to ransom, I don't believe they are. What they're doing is exercising their democratic and legitimate right to withdraw their labour. That isn't holding the country to ransom. That's simply exercising a right that's enshrined to them under law.
But if we're to make the economy work, don't we need, in return for any pay rises, changes in working practices? And we know, with the railways and with the Royal Mail particularly, there are some working practices like Sunday working being voluntary that have gone out in all other industries, and that we need a more productive, more successful economy, and people can be better paid if they can deliver more. And that needs to be the essential part of the conversation.
Well, I think there's often a myth that's promulgated about trade unions that they oppose every single change. And by and large, it's not true. I mean, I work in the fire and rescue service, and my union has been very much a part of the modernisation of the fire and rescue service. What unions are generally opposed to are changes, that are detrimental to the service and to the public good and public safety. And demands, for example, for productivity increases that are not accompanied by better conditions and better pay. I mean, in my view, what you generally find is if you put money on the table and offer workers a decent pay increase and decent conditions, they're much more amenable to the idea of changes to their conditions of service. So we shouldn't run away with the idea that unions are not interested in any change. I don't think that's borne out by history.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Paul. And we may not agree, but thank you also for your brave public service. I'm now going to turn to the panel, the former editor of The Sun, Kelvin Mackenzie, and the Labour MP, Lloyd Russell-Moyle. Kelvin, you had a lot of experience with the unions. You were involved in the move to Wapping. What do you think of the current strikes?
In some ways, they replicate them. The printing unions were a nightmare, a total collection of rather overpaid thugs, and they did phenomenally well out of weak management. Remember, this was a minute-to-minute business, so they had you very firmly like that.
My father was editing the Times.
He was.
And he knew very well what was going on.
He had you like that, and they thought, right, well, we'll just carry on paying. Eventually, they came across somebody who was prepared to stand up to them, Rupert Murdoch. They all lost their jobs, but they had won every battle up to then, so they were going to fight out that battle, and that was the end of that. So when you watch the RMT, and they say, we are not going to change our working conditions, despite the fact, by the way, that the revenues have collapsed by about 30%. They say, we're not going to change our conditions. Well, that's what Lynch said. He said, we are not, that's off the table. Then you can see that this strike, I expect this strike, the RMT strike, to go on until the next election when Labour get in, as I fully expect them to, and then they will write the cheque.
Look,
up until that moment, that's not...
What would Labour do to stop the railway strike?
Well, Labour in Wales has already started to negotiate, and the RMT have been willing to talk about changes in working practices. What they are not willing to talk about is redundancies and reductions of staff, but they are willing to talk about some of the crises that we have in the railways, which is, and you quite rightly point out, that we don't have a roster system properly for weekends and bank holidays, that we require goodwill. Now, that's just poor management, if you ask me. People should properly know people should properly know when they're going to work. We should not rely... And the big problem that we had on Southern Railways, even when we weren't on strike, if you remember, and some of the problems that they have on Avanti at the moment, is that even when they're not on strike, because there's not a proper roster, they rely on the goodwill of people doing a bit of extra time. They're not good contracts, and the RMT are very willing to talk about, and they've always been willing to talk about reform on Sunday.
Can we just deal... Hold on one second. Can we just deal then with the essential point on this, which is actually there are too many employees for the amount of revenue coming in, and that literally about a third of them have to go. Are you siding with the RMT and saying they've all got to stay in Aspic for the rest of their lives?
No, what we want and predict, and what even the Conservative government want to predict, is that railway usage will return back to pre-pandemic levels, which we've seen already starting to happen. And on bus travel, it has almost happened completely in the cities. And railway travel is always slightly behind that. And we grow it as well. The big, the northern developments in terms of Northern Rail, high speed, that will all have more
But don't we have to deal with things that change?
Here and now,
hold on, Kelvin, just a
minute.
minute.
It's not working.
Don't we have to deal with things that change? Because the reality is people don't use ticket offices in the way that they did. People all buy their tickets online, almost invariably, and therefore staffing ticket offices before people bought them online.
Ticket office staff are not represented by the RMT.
But in the overall rail strike, but you were saying no redundancies. There inevitably have to be changes when a business has changed fundamentally.
From London Underground is slightly different, but ticket office staff are represented by TSSA. Train drivers are represented by a different union as well.
Yeah,
so let's be clear. We're talking about the RMT strike. We're not talking about...
TSA have actually accepted the last deal, but even those guys recognise that sitting behind a ticket office all day long doing
That's
nothing
fine.
is not
That's
good for their mental health.
So they have negotiated, and they're willing to negotiate. I support unions and union staff, because where unions work well, and we've seen this in the car industry, actually, apart from some of the Brexit disasters we've got for the car industry at the moment, we've seen where unions have sat down in recent years with car manufacturers, and they've come out with deals that have allowed car manufacturing in this country to, until recently, actually be quite a success story. And I think the unions will do the same.
I think we're finding a degree of agreement
that
productivity increases do justify pay increases, but pay increases without productivity aren't. And the Sunday non-working goes back to an agreement prior to 1920, and the management needs agreement on that to change it. It's not incompetent management that has just allowed that to happen.
Well, I agree with you that for pay increases over the period that go above and beyond inflation, that needs to come with productivity increases. But we have seen a long period of stagnant wages that have not increased with inflation. And let's not look just at general inflation. Let's look at wage inflation in the private sector. I mean, I quite like the Norway model, where the public sector pay increases are pegged to the private sector pay increases, and so as the
public sector already get the most incredible bonanza in terms of non-pay. Pension payments of 23% from the employer are a dream if you get 4 to 6% in private.
The reality
why do you think all those teachers all quit at 50? They all claim stress. They're leaving. They are leaving because they can.
I want to leave you with the final thought before we go on to the next thing, which is that Wapping led to a golden age in newspapers. They made money, they increased employment, and it led to people reading
and
newspapers.
Survival of those businesses.
And new newspapers were launched, and it was a phenomenal change around from what had gone before.
It's astonishing. Honestly, Rupert Murdoch, the courage of that, was incredible. And if you ask those, look, I think there were 6,000 odd guys, mainly men, actually, almost completely men, actually went on to make other things of their lives in which they were doing jobs rather than turning up as Mickey Mouse and not doing any work and going down the pub. But look, I think when we look at some of these unions now, we have to accept. I mean, take Border Force. My brother went through Heathrow, coming in from the Caribbean in 29.4 seconds. He said he'd never.
When the army was in charge. Thank you, Kelvin and Lloyd. We'll be back with them in a moment. But we're getting the Shamima Begum debate continuing, with more controversies thrown into the mix. Find out after the break with these controversialists joining me.
I joined GB News because I was sick and tired of not hearing my views being represented, not just mine, but so many people that I knew and spoke to.
I just couldn't get my voice out there. I couldn't say anything. I couldn't do anything. Whatever the narrative was, I kind of had to follow it.
GB News is there to provide a voice for those who have been ignored by the establishment media. We think different things. We've got a different style.
GB News is here to be optimistic and positive about the future.
It's real kind of dynamic and flowing, with the audience very much at the heart of it, like a big family.
Here at GB News, we talk about the things that matter to you.
Hearing the voices from right across our towns and cities, especially our towns.
All sides of the argument represented with a heavy dose of opinion.
We're on a mission here to make a difference.
And the GB News family really is here for you, and whatever time of day you can watch or listen.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
You've probably seen politicians interviewed 1,000 times, but we do it differently. We find out who they really are, we don't shout, we chat, and hopefully we bring a bit of light, not just heat. Did you know Kate Moss?
Apparently.
Do you have a pair of jeans or a pair of jeans?
No, of course I don't. What would I do with them?
My friends are like, oh my God, what's she doing now?
Join me every Sunday at 6 for Gloria Meets, only on GB News. the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, the Member of Parliament for North East Somerset and a former government minister. For years, I have walked the corridors of power in both Westminster and the City of London. I campaigned in the largest democratic vote in our island's story. I know this country has so much to be proud of. We need to have the arguments, the discussions on how we make it better. The wisdom of the nation is in its people. Vox Populi, Vox Dei. That's why I'm joining the People's Channel. Join me Monday to Thursday at 8 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
I'm Mark White. As GB News Home and Security Editor, I cover those key issues that are so important to you. Our authorities, our communities doing all they can to combat violent crime. With the public services under unbearable strain, why are we still failing to control our borders? Defence, the first priority of any government, has been continually hollowed out. Can we trust our politicians to protect the armed forces? Join me, Mark White, on GB News.
Welcome back to State of the Nation. I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg. You've been getting in touch with your male Moggs. Dave. Jacob, I don't believe the nation is being held to ransom. I think the strikers have a right to strike and deserve a rise in most sectors. It's a tough one, but I back the efforts and believe they deserve at least inflation-level rise. Barbara. The print unions got too big and too militant. My dad was in the print in the 60s and 70s. Their demands contributed to the collapse and redundancies. Workers need representation, but the print workers got too greedy. Well, my father also worked in newspapers in the 60s and 70s, and if he was still alive, I know he would agree with Barbara's father. Last week, the decision to revoke Shamima Begum's citizenship was deemed lawful. But today, a government terror watchdog has suggested the UK fall in line with other Western countries in repatriating former IS recruits. Jonathan Hall KC, King's Counsel, the independent reviewer of terrorism legislation, said that Ms Begum is as much of a threat overseas as she is over here, under the watchful eye of the UK's justice system, and should be allowed back. This comes after our friends and allies like Germany, France and Sweden have increasingly allowed hundreds of former IS supporters back into their countries. As Mr Hall has said, are we in danger of falling out of step with our allies on issues such as these? Well, I'm glad to say still with me are my panel, Kelvin Mackenzie and Lloyd Russell Moyle. I'm not too fussed about being in step with our allies, but I think either you're a British citizen or you're not. And if you're a British citizen, you should be imprisoned in Britain if you've committed a crime, rather than thrown away.
She's not a British
On
citizen.
what basis is she Bangladeshi?
She's now stateless, right, which I am...
Well, we've said she's Bangladeshi.
Well, we hope she's Bangladeshi.
Well,
the Bangladeshis actually have said that they take her, actually, haven't they?
But she's not Bangladeshi. She's
never applied for citizenship and she's never been granted it so far.
Could you lose your citizenship?
Well, no, I would hope I would be to have my citizenship taken away if I were acting in the manner in which she chose to act. Let this be a warning to every other teenager out there who's thinking I'm going to go the same way.
I'll tell you why it's wrong. It's because citizenship can't be taken away from me, because I was born here and have no other citizenship. And I think there is an absolute equality of British citizenship. Either you are a British citizen entitled to those rights, or you're not. And I think taking it away is a discriminatory
same as a driving
policy.
licence. If you do something wrong, you're caught drink driving and kill somebody, then you lose your licence. And this is an honour to be a British citizen, and she has denied herself the honour.
A girl or a man raised here with British citizenship, Britain has to take some of the responsibility for this damaged individual.
Come on.
No. The responsibility is locking her up. The responsibility is giving her, the justice system putting her right, or locking her up forever if she can't be put right. But the idea that you say some of these poorest countries around the world should have to suffer people that were radicalised in Britain and then went off and caused havoc in their countries.
This must be right. We can't dump British citizens on some of the poorest countries in the world.
I hated that report, by the way. honestly, the report was basically, look what the others have done, we should do it, or there's going to be some other issue in Turkey which is going to blow up, which is going to make this all impossible. It was a poor piece of work, that, by the way, and the idea that when she comes back here she'll be under the scrutiny of MI6 or whatever. Look what happened at the Manchester Arena. If you want to see what happens when you just trust the intelligence.
But you're back from Syria, you've been there recently, you've been to the camps.
Yeah.
And you think the Kurds would like to try her and then have her serve her sentence in the United Kingdom?
Yes. I mean, it's the third time I've been. I'm the only MP to have gone so regularly. I was the first to go. But I always take Conservatives with me because it has to be cross-party.
Well, hoping they'd stay out there.
And what they're saying to me quite clearly is that they think justice should be done where the crime has been committed, so that they want some sort of tribunal. They say they can't do those tribunals just alone, partly because they're an autonomous region within Syria and they need a legal backing from the Allies, and our troops are still there, of course, serving alongside them with Americans defeating ISIS because it's an ongoing threat. But they then say once the trial system is set up, and they also need support because there's 10,000 of these jihadis in these camps that need processing, then what should happen is these people should be repatriated to serve their sentences either in the countries that they come from or from a variety of host countries around the world. And we've done this before. When we did the tribunals in Rwanda, when we did them in Sierra Leone, and we did Yugoslavia, they were tried in international tribunals in Sierra Leone and Rwanda in the place that the crime had been committed. And then the international community agreed to host these people in prisons around the world. And I think that's what should happen to her.
Can I ask one question? Do you know what kind of sentence... I mean, I think you'd actually find some viewers would be in favour of this. What kind of sentence the Kurds would likely to hand out to a Shamima or a Begum figure?
Well, they say they've got enough evidence that she was complicit. That's what they say.
And what does that mean? Does she get 20 years?
No, I think it wouldn't be capital punishment, but I think they would consider it for life. They would think that these people should not be out again. And I've visited and spoken to some of these individuals, some of the jihadis and the Beatles, so not Shamima, but some of the others. And when I visited them, they haven't shown great remorse. In fact, I went to speak to one of them, and it was pointed out the two MPs that were visiting were both gay, and they would have killed us. And he responded saying, yes, I did that to some of my friends. So this these are not people that I think need to be treated nicely, but these are people that we need to show and show justice happening, because actually the better deterrent, rather than is that you'll be randomly stripped of your citizenship, just like we did after the Second World War, after we did after Yugoslavia, after we did after all these, is that you have a trial and you lock them up for life and you show the world and you show the victims, because these people did horrific things to these victims.
That is true. In fact, the daughter of the shocking, the Haynes execution out there, which is beyond awful, when he was doing fantastic good work, honestly. Right, she says Shamima Begum should not come back. OK, she says it. And actually, if we're going to have victim impact statements, the one that I would be listening to would be the family of somebody who had been murdered out there.
Yes, but if we get them back and try them, or they go to prison, that's
don't
tried abroad. I think that's a very good idea.
Try them abroad.
We've ended up with a surprising amount of agreement, which I didn't think we'd get on this particularly brilliant panel. Coming up next, I will be talking to our former chief Brexit negotiator, Lord Frost, about the future of the Conservative Party and the Prime Minister's new Brexit deal. That's so exciting. You'll be back in 3 minutes, not a second late. Otherwise, it's tardy book.
First and foremost, I'm a GB News fan, and I was before I was working here. Just love the fact that we're asking the questions that a lot of establishment media won't ask.
With a bit of a twist, we not only want to inform you, but we want to keep you entertained.
It's worth the drive because you get in and the team's all ready and waiting, they're itching to go, and it's a proper little family.
GB News is the People's Channel.
It's the audience that makes the programme sing.
We're giving our viewers and our listeners a voice. I see the thousands of your letters, tweets, emails, you name it, coming in.
Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it?
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent you.
It's time for something different. It's time for GB News. I'm very patriotic. I believe in Britain. Our best days lie ahead.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Join us here on GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Hi, Andrew Pierce here. Join me every Friday lunchtime for a proper no-nonsense debrief of the week's events. With special guests in the studio and the GB News team on the ground, I'll be getting you up to date with news, some intelligent discussion and my own sharp take. The weekend starts here with me every Friday lunchtime on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Michael Portillo. Join me on GB News on a Sunday morning for topical discussion, debate, arts and culture, and sometimes even some ethical dilemmas.
I don't always agree with you, Michael.
Michael Portillo, Sundays on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Here on GB News Live, we'll be keeping you in the picture, finding out what's happening across the country and finding out why it matters to you. We'll have the facts fast with our team of reporters and specialist correspondents. Wherever it's happening, we'll be there from 12 noon on TV, radio and online. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics, and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Lawrence Fox, on GB News. Frank, fun, fearless, and sometimes serious. Much as I love a Friday night punch-up, what I really want is a battle of ideas. I want to look at things differently. I want to hear different voices and engage with your unique experiences. Every Friday at 7 p.m. on GB News.
My next guest was once called by Boris Johnson the greatest frost since the Great Frost of 1709. But I think he's an even greater frost, the sort of frost that would have defeated Napoleon in 1812. So, the Great Frost.
I can't follow that. Great to be here.
Well, thank you for coming on. I want to first of all talk about the NIP, the Northern Ireland Protocol, because you had a very interesting and thoughtful piece in the Telegraph this morning, where, if I understood it correctly, you're saying it's not perfect, there are legal issues with it, but it's better than what preceded it, and that we need to bag these incremental improvements.
So I think the incremental improvements are worth having. They'll probably make some difference to the situation. What worries me is that we're going to find the protocol entrenched as a result of this deal. And what I was trying to do, what the Boris Johnson government was trying to do when we were in power, was, once we run into problems with the protocol, to begin to roll it back, either by negotiation or some other way. In other words, to replace EU law by UK law. We didn't succeed in that. What the current team have done is simply more or less keep the protocol in place but soften it slightly. Mm-hmm. So we were trying to change the situation. This is really continuity with the previous situation, just not so harshly implemented. So I worry that one effect is going to be the protocol stays for a longer time.
And the not so harshly implemented was actually in the protocol itself, that the ability to renegotiate it and ease it as technology improved was part of what was agreed in 2019.
Yeah, the protocol itself is quite a broad brush document and leaves a lot to be worked out by implementation. And that's why the EU's been able to do what it's doing now within the framework of basically the same text. It allows a lot of room for interpretation.
And the interpretation of the text ultimately lies with the European Union rather than with His Majesty's government. So if you take the green lane and the red lane, the green lane will be green as long as the UK doesn't diverge, or if it does diverge, the EU will have to accept that divergence. If it doesn't like it, it can turn the green lane red, make it incarnadine.
Yes, absolutely. The whole thing is conducted under EU law, and even the areas where
UK standard goods are now allowed into Northern Ireland, that exclusion is accomplished under EU law. The scope of EU law has not really changed at all, and that includes the Green Lane, it includes the Trusted Trader Scheme. We are reliant on a good relationship with the EU to make this work, and let's hope we have one, that Brexit isn't about having bad relationships with our neighbours, but history suggests it may not always be like that.
Yes, that's important, that if we can improve the relations, it's worth doing.
Absolutely.
But to some extent, this deal's been oversold, because if I've understood the VAT correctly, it will be possible to change VAT on fixed goods, but not on movable goods that may be able to go over the border into the single market.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, I'm not looked at the precise detail in every area because it's a very complex set of text, but certainly it isn't full freedom on VAT. It's not full freedom on excise duties. The suggestion that some government ministers have made that all trade barriers disappear is I'm afraid not true. They're thinner and would certainly be easier to operate, but they haven't disappeared. So it's softer. It's a softer trade border, but there is still a trade border, I fear.
That will be, yes. But let's move to the future of the Tory party, because the Tory party's now been talking about Brexit probably since the Maastricht Treaty in 1992. But there's so much more to the Tory party than that. We were at a meeting together earlier in the Houses of Parliament on the growth group of MPs. How do you think we get growth? Because everyone's promising it at the moment.
We have to get back to some of the truths we know about how an economy works. And if you've got a high tax, high spend model with very expensive energy, for example, you're going to have slower growth. All history points to that fact. If you try and control too much economic activity with the government, you're going to have problems. And what we need to do is reduce the scope of government involvement in the economy. It's at a historic high. We can comfortably reduce it. If we could get it down to the level of when Gordon Brown was Prime Minister, we'd think we were doing a fantastic job. That's how bad things have got, and we've really got to change direction.
And if we don't get growth, we then can't afford the public services, is the fundamental point underlying this.
That's the problem. If the economy does not grow, and it hasn't been growing much per head for quite some time now, we can't pay for anything else. And getting that back, Liz Truss was right on that, getting back to growth is crucial.
But was the problem with what Liz Truss was trying to do, and I was a great supporter of hers and in her government, that we were doing the tax cuts, but we weren't doing the recasting of the state, and therefore the gap with expenditure and income was widening. And actually, it's about reducing what the state does.
Yeah, there's always a temptation for governments to have it both ways. I'm not sure it actually was Liz Truss's intention, of course. She didn't communicate it well, and some of the timing was wrong, but I'm sure there was an intention to cut spending too. But markets look to this, they know there's always a temptation to cut taxes and worry about the spending later. So if you're serious, you've got to try and do both. And with spending at 48% of GDP, there's definitely room for some savings, I think.
Indeed, and start with the efficiency savings. And then with an ageing population, you've got lots of pressures, though, coming from welfare and from healthcare and from social care. And those are only affordable if you make a bigger economy. I mean, it's Margaret Thatcher's term, you bake a bigger cake rather than slicing up the current cake.
Absolutely right. You know, historically, this country, since the war, has grown by 2-3%. We're lucky 4% per head in a few years. In the last few years, we've been growing up between 0 and 1%. And that makes a big difference over a long period of time.
And electorally, can the Conservatives recover in time, particularly if people don't feel better off? Wasn't it the Ronald Reagan question, do you feel better off than you felt 4 years ago? If the answer to that is no, that's very hard for a party to win another period in office.
It is. It's not the only thing, obviously. John Major failed to win, even though statistically people were better off in 97. I think we definitely need to try and recover growth. We also need to give people a sense of the direction. I think that if we are re-elected, we're going to deliver genuinely conservative policies that, for a mix of circumstance and lack of will, we haven't delivered over the last few years. People have got to know what they're getting, I think, and communicate a real sense of direction, enthusiasm, belief in what we're trying to do.
Direction, enthusiasm and belief is exactly what we need. Thank you so much, David. That's all from us this evening. We'll be back tomorrow night from 8 p.m. Up next, it's Patrick Christie in for Dan Wootton. Patrick,
Yes, exactly.
what
It's
have you
a
got in
bombshell.
your box of tricks tonight?
Oh, it's a bombshell show, Jacob,
you.
a bombshell show. I am asking whether or not Matt Hancock has blood on his hands. Is King Charles right to make Harry and Meghan homeless in the UK? And police getting involved when it comes to a copy of the Quran being damaged in a school? I've got a strong suspicion that they wouldn't have done the same if it was a copy of the Bible. What's all that about? I've got a superstar panel. I will be with you, lighting up your telly from 9 until 11. In for the man himself, Dan Wootton. Back to you, Jacob.
Well, that sounds too exciting for words, Patrick. That's all coming up after the break, and you, of course, won't want to miss it. Thank you to all my guests tonight. We'll be back tomorrow from 8 p.m, but we won't know one thing about the weather, and that is the frost is lifted, and we've got the broad, sunlit uplands.
Good evening, I'm Alex Deakin, and this is your latest weather forecast from the Met Office. A few showers around this evening, but they'll fade overnight, and most will have a dry day tomorrow. Probably a bit brighter across the south, but again, something of a chilly feel. High pressure is controlling our weather, but it's sitting up to the north, so the winds around it are bringing in cooler conditions from the North Sea, and particularly across eastern areas. We've seen quite a few showers in here. We'll keep one or two going across southeast Scotland, northeast England, and even a few for Wales and southwest England this evening, but they should tend to fade away through the night. Some clearer skies developing across East Anglia, and the southeast may allow some pockets of frost here, and certainly a frost in western and northern Scotland, where we've got light winds and clear skies, maybe down to -3 here in some rural spots. But it should be a bright start here and a brighter day to come tomorrow across the south compared to today. Still fairly cloudy elsewhere, but not as many showers. Much of eastern England will be dry. A few showers through the central belt, the odd light one for Northern Ireland, but they will be light and they should tend to drift away. So most dry through the afternoon. Where it stays cloudy, it's going to feel pretty chilly again, 7 or 8 Celsius, but with some sunny spells in the south, we might get up to double figures, 11, and maybe 10 on the west coast of Scotland too. Again, well, we've got clear skies on Thursday evening. It will likely turn fairly frosty. Quite a bit of cloud coming in again from the east, but not too many showers around at this stage. So most of us looking dry as we head into Friday. Again, a frost likely in northern Scotland for sure, and anywhere where we've got clearer skies through the nights. But then we should see, again, spells of sunshine developing during Friday. A fine day for much of Scotland, light winds, sunny spells. Some cloud for England, Wales and Northern Ireland, but a bit of sunshine is likely in eastern areas. So a brighter day here and probably feeling a bit warmer too, although still on the chilly side for most, but generally 7 to 9 Celsius. Signs of things turning colder though for next week.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, "Nana, stop arguing." I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment. I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Hello, I'm Esther McVeigh.
And I'm Philip Davis.
Whether you're watching or listening on TV, online or on radio, we handpick the latest stories, debates and expert opinions for your weekend. So whether that's politics, news or showbiz, we've got it covered.
Join us every Saturday morning at 10 o'clock on GB News.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
GB News has its own late-night paper preview show, Headliners, where comedians take you through the next day's top news stories. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper, we've got it covered for you. Headliners, every night at 11 p.m. and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Nana Akue, Saturday and Sunday afternoons on GB News. Expect fiery debate and passionate discussion as me and my panel tackle some of the biggest topics hitting the headlines. It's a place for everyone's opinion. No one gets cancelled, but no one gets an easy ride.
Oh, she's on it today!
Be ready for conversations that are fierce, frank, and of course, fun. Every Saturday and Sunday afternoon from 4 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel.
We are GB News, the People's Channel.
And right across the United Kingdom.
You can find us on Sky Channel 512,
Virgin Media Channel 604,
Freesat Channel 216,
Freeview Channel 236,
And YouView Channel 236.